Hey guys, welcome to the Kane audio vlog and what is part 3 to the studio build. If you haven't already seen part 1 and 2, go and watch them now. To give you a rough idea, as a rough rundown, part 1 I went through the structure and the choices in whether I buy an off-the-shelf package or build it all from scratch. Part 2 I covered the electrics, the getting internet from the building to the garden, from the house to the garden I should say, and security issues like alarms, CCTV, all the pernickety stuff. I think I talked about the flooring and the heating as well. So that's part 2. Now part 3, I kind of wanted to focus on the audio and acoustics in general. So there's a few things to cover here. I think before I start going into that, the first thing I need to clarify is that a lot of people call acoustic treatment soundproofing, and it's not about soundproofing. So if you're in the back room of your house, for example, and you're putting up these black panels you can see behind me, or whatever colour, of acoustic treatment, that's not soundproofing. It's not designed to stop the sound leaving the room. It's designed to stop the reflections coming back at you. It does absorb some sound, and it does help lower the amount of sound going through the walls, but that's not its main objective. So on that, I think I have to clarify that when I was building this structure, I had no intention of fully soundproofing. One of the main reasons for that, I think, would be because of cost. It just wasn't. I think when you go into fully soundproofing, you have floating floors and ceilings, and the walls are separated. It's you want multiple walls with air gaps, and I felt like that was probably overkill. I am not a drummer. I am unlikely to ever have a drummer in here. So I don't need high volume stuff. I work. I wouldn't say it's too loud, but it's not. I don't have the gain up super loud generally. So I didn't feel like I needed to soundproof this place. On top of that, it's worth pointing out that actually I like the return as well. So right now, for example, I can hear there's a little bit of wind outside. The weather has turned, so earlier today I could hear the rain on the roof, and I like that. I like being at one with nature. And that's kind of what I wanted with this, because I felt like I'm building somewhere in the garden, so I'm not joined on to my next door neighbours in any way, shape or form. And I'm the nearest building to this cabin is I don't know, 50, 60, 70 foot away. So it's not essential that I have this fully soundproofed. I've also got double French doors, and so on a nice summer's day, it's nice to be able to sort of open those out and be writing music in my environment rather than just closed off in a dark room, which is how I've always traditionally worked. So I think that's important to get across. Downside of that is obviously doing these videos. Sometimes you'll hear the neighbour's dog bark or whatever, so it's something to think about if you guys are thinking of doing this yourself. But for me, I just felt like I don't work excessively loud, and I tend to work roughly Monday to Friday 9 to 5, so I'm kind of uninterrupted, and I'm kind of uninterrupting for my neighbours as well. I don't, there we go. So that's a waffle on soundproofing. The other thing to mention is the acoustic panels I use in this room are GIK Acoustic Treatments. They were a recommended company to me at the time that I bought them, and I bought them in my last studio, which was a big industrial site. So I actually, when I first finished building this place, I started dragging in all the acoustic treatment panels. I actually found just by ear the room suddenly started getting a bit too dark and a bit too cramped and sounding a bit too dead. So I actually took a load of panels back out then. So I guess the big question is how I sort of went about it. And if I'm totally honest, it's partially trial and error, partially experience. So I'm going to try and cover how I did that. One thing to clarify on as well is that I know from past experience, when you're looking at treating your room, and I'm assuming that most of you watching this want to be able to treat your bedroom, back room, garden shed, wherever it is you write your music. And the first thing you do is you jump on Google and you start searching how to treat a room or whatever. You will find people who obsess over details on the internet, and they will tell you you're wrong about everything. And I just want to sort of clarify that quite often those are the people that maybe spending more time obsessing over details about acoustic treatment than actually producing music. And there has to be a balance somewhere, and I think that's quite important to get across, because I know the first time I ever started getting into room treatment, people were talking about very specific frequencies and very specific dimensions of a room, and while it's true to an extent, at the end of the day you work with what you've got. So what else do I need to cover about this structure? One thing that a lot of people will probably notice is that I'm working widthways in this room. I know maybe with this camera view you don't get to see the whole room. You're a good 10 foot away from me basically, so I am working widthways. And one of the first things you'll see looking up online, people recommend you don't work widthways, you work lengthways. And that does make a lot of sense, because normally you want any sound waves that come out the speakers to go behind you and to take much longer to then bounce off a wall and come back to your head, so you're not hearing this resonance point and ugly decay. Whereas again, the reality is somewhat different. So in this structure, I've actually got big acoustic curtains behind me, so with very set specific gaps, air gaps behind them as well, so that actually the audio will sort of just about scrape through that curtain, hit the wall, bounce back, and then just get stopped by the curtain. So it's really quite dead behind me, so it's as if I'm working in a very long room. And the other thing is that I've got a window and doors there, so yeah, there was that to take into account. Now, once I'd brought in my acoustic treatment panels, the plan was to put them up approximately where I wanted them, and then sort of work a few tests. In terms of tests, I am a big fan of Room EQ Wizard. It's some free software. I believe it's Mac and Windows. And if you have a test mic, I've got one here in fact that I was using. So this is a fairly cheap, it's a Behringer ECM 8000. If you're looking at running tests and stuff, then they're worth having. I think they're about 30, 40, 50 quid on eBay secondhand if you want one cheap. So yeah, I'd recommend that. You can Google for a calibration file for those microphones. Personally, I don't even bother with the calibration file, because I accept that there's going to be a certain amount of roll-off. And again, these things that, whilst they are an exact science, the reality is always somewhat different. So, you can measure the dimensions of this room as much as you want, but you can't predict where the sound wave, for example, is going to come off a monitor speaker I'm pointing at now and hitting the table here, and then there's a keyboard here, and then there's a bit of shelf here, and then there's a chair here, and so on and so forth. There are so many diffraction spaces in a room. And this is why I say that people on the internet will quite often argue about the dimensions of a room within millimeters, but the reality is quite different when you actually put it into practice. So I'm going to be kind of vague with all of this. The rule of thumb to remember when you're putting up acoustic treatment panels is that the trick is to get a friend of yours to hold a mirror on the wall and start sliding the mirror across the wall, and you sit in your listening position, and the moment you can see, so I'll do it this way for you guys, the moment you can see the monitor speaker in the mirror is where you want to be placing those acoustic panels. That's the first general rule of thumb. Then secondly, you want to understand that bass sound waves love corners. So if you're going to be working in a less than ideal size room, which I would say this is probably a little bit less than ideal in terms of size, hence the bass traps in all four corners in this room. I think that's quite important. Room EQ Wizard, onto that then. So let me show you what I've got on my screen here. I've got a waterfall graph that I've created. Basically, you can take measurements of your room. Unfortunately, I didn't save. There was a whole bunch of measurements that I probably should have saved for this video. I didn't do that. And what you want to do is you want to take out a load of averages as well. So when you're holding your test mic, you want to put it in your listening position. So if I'm sat here playing keyboard, then you want to be pointing the mic at your computer screen at your head position. Take a load of measurements, and it just does a sweeping sine wave and reads the return signal through the microphone. And once you've done that, then I would usually move the microphone to the right a bit and take another test to the left of where your head is, take another test slightly below, slightly above, and so on. Take as many measurements as you can around what you're going to consider your sweet spot for listening, basically. And then once you've done that, you can average those out and then save it as one final file. This is one of those measurements on the screen at the minute, and you can see there's all sorts in there. You can measure decays and so on and so forth, and spectrograms and scopes. I've gone on to Waterfall, hit generate, and it'll give me a waterfall graph. And what this shows me is the amplitude over frequency. So your y-axis is your amplitude, your x-axis is your frequency, and then your z-axis is is your decay time. So what we're kind of looking for here, and again, it's I keep saying this, it's not an exact science. It is an exact science, but it's also, you've got to allow for allowances, basically. I think people generally say you want for a good quality room, you can kind of allow for a plus minus 6 dB. To me, I feel like plus minus 6 dB is quite substantial. So I'd really rather aim for maybe 2 or 3 dB plus or minus. So in the initial room tests, you can see there's quite big gaps here, for example, which is around the 50 hertz, and then there's another one up here which is around the 100 and a bit hertz, which I'm not overly bothered by. And then when you factor in all the peaks and crests, I did put some maths into it at the time, and I think it worked out. I think it was about plus or minus 3 or 4 dB at the time. I can zoom out here to the full 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Yeah, and you can see where the decay times are. So the further these come out, the more reverb you've got, basically. That's kind of what we're talking about. And as you can see here, I'm barely going over sort of 80 milliseconds of decay time, and that's only in the very low bass, which you'd kind of expect to be fairly decayy. And with the room being fairly dead, with acoustic treatment panels being put up, there's really not much echo in this room, as I'm sure you can tell by the audio you're hearing through my microphone right now. It's not exactly an echo chamber. So yeah, so that's worth doing with Room EQ Wizard. There are tutorials on YouTube, so I'm not going to go into crazy details on this. And again, a lot of people will argue about what to look for and what not to look for, but essentially you just don't want huge decays, and perhaps more importantly, you don't want things too far off balance. So if you go to your, for example, your SPLs, you can then smooth out the graphs as well, and you can see where all the peaks and troughs are. So yeah, so that was my Room EQ Wizard session, and what I actually did was I started, you won't see it on the video at the minute, but there is a subwoofer in here. I started with that in the middle of the room, kind of near my feet, and everything just didn't quite seem right, and then I ended up moving it to kind of where below the camera now, at the back of the room, and again that didn't quite work out, and there's a phase switch on the sub, and reversing the polarity of that just didn't seem to fix it. There was basically a huge drop at, I think, about 40 hertz, and it just wasn't sitting right. In fact, this is probably the point where I should mention a fantastic product called Reference 4 by Sonarworks. Again, if you look on YouTube, there'll be tutorials on how to use that as well, but essentially using Room EQ Wizard, you can find some of the fundamentals and where the issues are. It's quite handy for just taking a very quick simple test of the room and getting a general idea of what works and what doesn't. I had a couple of issues with the subwoofer, so I ended up moving it around the room. Similarly, I find, and this is perhaps one of the biggest tricks you can do, it's just move your monitor speakers. You'd be surprised the difference it makes. Just pulling them 5-6 inches away from the wall, maybe 10-12 inches away from the wall. Take a couple of tests and just see how different those waterfall graphs come out. You know, and there's no right or wrong necessarily for each room and each speaker. It's just trial and error a lot of the time. So that's where Room EQ Wizard comes into play. So I then, after this waterfall graph, I took some more moving stuff around, and eventually I'd kind of got it as flat as I possibly could. So I think I was down to about plus minus 4 dB at any given point, and it was flat-ish, and that's when I move on to Sonarworks Reference. So for anyone that doesn't know, Sonarworks have released a bit of software called Reference 4. It's a fantastic bit of kit. There's probably loads of videos on YouTube for it, so I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail, but essentially it's a room correction software. And I've always kind of had my hesitations when it comes to this sort of software, because I always feel like in an ideal world you want to get your room right first before you start using this software. However, for long-time viewers of this channel, you'll know I've spent the last 18 months, maybe even 2 years, in the back room of the house while I planned and saved for this place, and that place was far from ideal. It was a tiny little box of a room, and I knew there were huge spikes at certain frequencies, and there was just nothing I could do. There was no amount of acoustic treatment that I could put in that room that would have changed anything. It was just one of those sorts of situations. And again, I know a lot of you watching this will probably be in a similar situation. So I'll put over the screen now. What you'll see is a screenshot of Sonarworks and its correction. You can see in the blue is the before signal and the purple is the after signal, and obviously the red is your target. Ideally you want a flat line. Now, bearing in mind that I'm using a test microphone and I'm not using the calibration file, so I'm going to expect a certain amount of roll off from sort of 10k and up, and I'm going to expect a certain amount below sort of 50 hertz or so as well. So looking at the screen, you can see that this is the amount of spike and trough that I had in the back room. If you have a look here, the before was hugely out of phase. You can see these lines should be on top of each other really, because your left and right should be near enough identical, but there were definitely huge phase discrepancies. And I mean, how big is that dip? That's probably about minus 10 dB at 100 hertz, which is kind of your sweet spot, near enough for a good baseline. And then 120 hertz ish, or 150 hertz, there's a huge 6 dB spike. So that kind of constantly threw everything out when it came to baselines. Then I've got another screenshot I'll have here. This is after I'd built this studio, and so if I compare the two, you can see that huge spike. Let's focus on this drop and this spike, and then knock it down to once I'd built this place. Now there was a huge spike over here and a huge drop over here. I'd got that down to plus minus 6 dB, where the previous one was plus minus 10, nearly 12 dB. So I'd halved the difference there. So that was clearly a big thing. But now, because of the room dimensions had changed slightly, I was now dealing with a fairly big spike. I mean, that's a 3 dB spike at, what's that, about 40 hertz or so, and then almost 6 dB drop at 80 hertz, which is really where I quite like, that's getting into your real bass lines there. So that's where I started playing around with moving the subwoofer and everything, because while everything kind of sounded fine in this room, I knew it wasn't completely accurate. So again, it was a case of trial and error between Room EQ Wizard and taking some frequency shots and then just moving speakers around just ever so slightly, pulling them away from the wall, putting them nearer the wall. I ended up then putting the subwoofer down in the far corner and backing it up against a corner trap. So it was really only taking anything out of the front drivers, and I then turned it down fairly low. Not that I needed it particularly high in here anyway. Played around with the EQs, and then the final result is this on your screens now. So you can see the difference where I did have previously from moving, and this is really the difference of moving a speaker. I did have a 3 dB spike and a 6 dB trough, and then after moving the speaker I had, well, that's no spike and then a 3 dB trough over there. So it's really trying to pull itself back up at 100 hertz, and then another 3 dB spike at whatever that is, about 160ish, and then that's it basically. So I'm in that plus minus 3 dB range, and that's where I'm comfortable with most rooms. And I feel like unless you're building a huge commercial studio, then plus minus 3 dB is very acceptable, I think. So that's where I ended up, and that is where I'm kind of happy. So I think that the takeaways from this really is, first of all, don't overkill with acoustic treatment, and don't confuse acoustic treatment for soundproofing. They're two very different things. Like I say, I can hear stuff outdoors and I can step outdoors and hear stuff inside, and for me, I wanted that in this structure. So yeah, and I guess the second takeaway from this video is hopefully the mirror test. That's worth doing for everyone, and then using Room EQ Wizard, and then kind of following that up with Sonarworks Reference 4, and I think that then just corrects for that, and it's about finding the peaks and troughs, and trying to sort of manually hone them in as best as you can just by moving things around the room. I'll give you another example of how important placement of things are. In my last studio, I actually built the entire internals of the industrial unit to have the control desk facing a window that looked into the live room, and I'd built everything to be working in that direction. And then I set everything up and did Room EQ Wizard, and there were just a few fiddly details, and it basically turned out that the only place that it really sounded great was when the speaker was right in front of the door that entered the room, which clearly I couldn't do. So I then had to basically pick up everything in the room, turn it all sideways to the room, and then run some tests there, and it worked out perfect. So I actually ended up working sideways in that room purely because it sounded better. So I think that's probably your biggest takeaway from this video, is you'd be surprised how much of a difference placement is. And that, my friends, is it. I think that pretty much takes us up to today. This is potentially an ongoing series. Like I say, for those of you that have been following the channel for a long time. So hopefully do maybe a part 4 in 6 months time. Let's see where we are after the winter. I think that's probably the next big test of this space. As I've said in part 1 and or 2, I had to have quite a limited space in here due to the size of the garden, the budget, the landscape of the garden is probably more important. So everything's had an impact, and so things like heating and insulation and lighting and all of those things will not really take effect in a big way until the winter kicks in, which is not that far away now. We're heading towards September. This year has flown by, which is probably a good thing, because this year's pretty much sucked for everyone. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that someone somewhere has found some of this useful. If you have, then let me know, drop a comment below. As usual, please do share these videos far and wide. The more they get shared, the more they help, so that can only be a good thing. I'll see you soon. Cheers.